Okay, Brock here, checking in. Just about a week after the conversation with Dr. Murthy. Just sitting outside of a Walgreens right now. Got my appointment to get my first dose here in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to move forward and make it happen.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you see a study that comes out from Mayo that says the Pfizer vaccine is 43% effective against the Delta variant, right? And then you see that you start hearing stories in the last 5 to 6 days that the prevalence of this Mu variant is starting to pop up, and that potentially the current vaccine that we have has zero efficacy.
Let's talk about the numbers that you saw from the Mayo Clinic, because I want to put that in context. But hey, Brock.
Dr. Murthy, pleasure to see you. I will just get down to where this all started. You know, I've got a nephew, or a soon-to-be nephew, that's going to be born here. And this conversation has weighed heavily with me being unvaccinated and them, preferring that I be vaccinated in order to see the newborn. And so this has been an emotional decision. There's just been a lot of questions that have come up for me personally, whether it's from social media or whether it's from the mainstream media, trying to dissect what is real and what's not, and what's misinformation, and who you can trust. Looking forward to hearing some answers.
Well, listen, I'm happy to dig into any questions you've got, and we can go in whatever order is most helpful to you. So
talking about the side effects, right? I mean, just maybe walk through some of the major ones. I mean, I've heard in my personal circle, I've known of people that have had Bell's palsy as a result of the vaccine, or have come down with Bell's palsy shortly after receiving the vaccine. Maybe touch on some of the prevalence of the side effects of getting the vaccine and what the likelihood of some of that is.
When it comes to the vaccines, the most common side effect that people have are fever, chills, body ache, and a feeling of fatigue afterward. That's what I felt, actually, when I got the vaccine. When I got my first shot, and I got the Pfizer vaccine, when I got my first shot, I remember my arm felt like really heavy and I felt achy, but it lasted just for maybe half a day. When I got my second shot, I felt a little feverish, I felt pretty fatigued, and I felt achy for about somewhere between 12 to 24 hours, and then I was fine after that. That's the most common experience that people have if they have side effects. And again, the majority of people don't feel much of anything. In terms of the rare side effects, or the really infrequent ones, there have been reports with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines of a condition called myocarditis. That's an inflammation of the heart muscle. The good news about myocarditis, when it happens related to the COVID-19 vaccines, is they're usually mild and they resolve without much treatment. And that's good news. And when they happen in folks who are younger, and with a predominance in men and young and sort of adolescent boys. But here's another thing that's interesting and important to note. If you get COVID, your chances of actually having myocarditis are much, much higher than if you get the vaccine. The other side effect that you may have heard about is with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which has to do with rare blood clots, which form. This is one of the reasons the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was paused for deeper investigation earlier in the spring. But what they concluded, the CDC afterward, and what independent scientists who looked at this concluded as well, was that these are quite infrequent, these rare blood clots. And in fact, when people had COVID-19, they were at significantly higher risk of getting blood clots as well. But when you weigh the benefits and the risks, which is what we all have to do, it becomes much more clear then that the benefits of the vaccines in terms of preventing COVID and all of its complications far outweighs the much, much smaller risk that come with the vaccines. This is a conversation, Brock, that I've had to have with many patients over the years, and we sit down and we talk it through, and no two people are the same, right? Everyone's got their own concerns, their own particular health profile. And so we would sit down, we would talk about it, understand what their beliefs were, what their experiences were, and then try to figure out where do the benefits outweigh the risks. And then that's a place where we should move forward with the treatment. In this case, the advice I've given family and friends, the reason I got my mother and father, and my sibling, my sister and my close friends all vaccinated was because I looked at that data. I looked at the real world experience of what was going on with COVID-19, how we were learning more and more about how even young people could be affected by things like long COVID. And it became much more clear to me that, the benefits here of the vaccine are remarkable, and they really outweigh the risks for the vast majority of people.
Talking about the vaccination, I guess the process. We're hearing about these variants right now. It sounds like we're in the midst of this Delta variant, right? I mean, this is the predominant variant, correct, in the country?
That's exactly right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you see a study that comes out from Mayo that says the Pfizer vaccine is 43% effective against the Delta variant, right? And then you see that you start hearing stories in the last 5 to 6 days that the prevalence of this Mu variant is starting to pop up, and that potentially the current vaccine that we have has zero efficacy, or it seems that's what I'm reading here as of the last couple days. So if I'm thinking about moving forward and trying to keep pace with these mutations, I mean, what does this look like? What is this research that's being done right now? It feels like I'm taking yesterday's news if I'm taking the current vaccine through Pfizer.
Yeah, so this is a really important question because we are going to hear more news about different variants that pop up over time. Here's a good news in what we've seen so far. The vaccines that we have in the United States, including the Pfizer, Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, they've actually continued to be very effective against all of these variants, particularly when it comes to preventing hospitalization and death. Okay, and that's the most important outcome that we want to prevent, right? They've continued to be effective against Delta, against the Alpha variant, and against the variant that was present before that. Now, let's talk about the numbers that you saw from the Mayo Clinic, because I want to put that in context. What we know is that with vaccines in general, over time, we tend to see a reduction in the protection that people get. And with Delta as well, given that it's a tougher variant, so to speak, we need a bigger army, like inside of us. You can think of it as more antibodies to ultimately address Delta most effectively. And that's why what we started to see in studies like Mayo, and Mayo's not the only one, is that there has been a reduction in protection that people get against mild and moderate disease with the Delta variant, especially if they've been vaccinated a while ago. But the good news is that to date, we've still seen strong protection against severe disease and hospitalizations and death. But we anticipate that in the months ahead, that some of that protection may start to erode, which is why we recently said that we think a third dose will be necessary. It's very common for vaccines to require 3 doses, right? If you have ever gotten a hepatitis B vaccine, which a lot of people who work in healthcare have gotten, a lot of students have gotten as well. That's a vaccine that you get on day month 0, and then month 1, and then month 6, right? So you get 3 shots, and then you're good for many years thereafter. And it's very possible that this vaccine will likely end up being like that. You need several doses, and once you have protection, then you're good for a while. But it's because we started to see that reduction in protection against mild and moderate disease that we think that additional shot is going to be important. And right now we're waiting for the FDA to evaluate the safety data on a third dose. And as soon as they give the green light and the CDC gives the green light, then we can start rolling that out. But the bottom line is that the vaccines have still worked really well up until this point, particularly to keep people out of the hospital and to save their lives. It's kind of like if you and I are driving our car, right? Again, we start to get to where our fuel gauge, light turns on saying that, fuel is low, then we'll stop and we will refill our tank, right? It doesn't mean that the gas we had in the beginning didn't work. It got us to where we needed to go, but then we needed to refuel at some point. And that's a signal that we're starting to see. Vaccines worked really well, but they need an additional shot, and that's what we're getting ready to deliver.
I think that is one of the most important distinctions, and one of the things that maybe I'm not hearing, or a lot of people that are not hearing, is that the idea in my head, prior to coming on here, was that, okay, well, this booster, we're going to have to get a booster every 6 months, every 3 months, whatever it's going to be. And what does that mean? And what does a true victory over COVID actually look like if we're sitting there doing that every 6 months?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. And, I think the most important thing we've got to do if we want to be victorious against COVID-19 is make sure that we prevent people from losing their life, right? Or ending up in the hospital getting severely ill. That's the most important goal. And the good news is that the vaccines we have, they actually do that. They help us achieve that goal. But what we have to do is make sure that as many people as possible get it. And what we're seeing right now with Delta is actually helping us understand even more clearly the difference between how people are faring who are vaccinated and those who are not vaccinated. There's a general understanding, I think, in the public that only older people were at risk, right? That's if you're a senior citizen or you had a whole bunch of medical conditions, you're the only one who really needed to worry about COVID-19. But if you go into our hospitals now, Brock, and if you look around, if you talk to doctors and nurses and you say, who's in the hospital? You will find that there are a lot of younger people who are in the hospital. There are a lot of children who are in the hospital. There's, I think, a notion out there that's incorrect that somehow the virus is harmless in people who are younger. And we're seeing that that's not the case. And especially when you've got something like Delta, which spreads so easily and is so contagious that a lot more people are infected, you start to see that even though it's a small portion of folks who get severely ill and end up in the hospital, that translates to a large number of people. The more of us who get infected, that means that we can pass the virus on to other people, right? So sometimes, and we saw this happen a lot over the last 18 months, sometimes somebody will get sick and they won't be that affected. They maybe have a mild illness, but they'll infect people around them who are more vulnerable. Maybe they're immunocompromised, maybe they're older, maybe just out of bad luck, they get infected. We know the vaccines, they're highly effective, but they're not 100%. So there's a small portion of people whose bodies may not rev up, and generate the kind of immune response they need. So anyway, these are all the reasons why we've realized it's so important to get everyone in society vaccinated as quickly as possible. And the faster we do that, not only will we save more lives, prevent transmission, but it'll actually help reduce the chances that more variants will develop over time. Because the variants can only develop when they're replicating inside our body.
Is there a scientific or medical community consensus on therapeutics or the treatment of COVID at this point? Hospital to hospital, state to state, is there a defined treatment regimen at this point?
There have been actually advances in developing treatments for COVID-19, and there are several that are actually available. They include what are called monoclonal antibodies, which are these synthetic antibodies, which antibodies are the soldiers in your immune system that help to tackle infection when it attacks your body. And these synthetic antibodies have actually proven to be really effective when they're given early in the course of illness. There are other treatments too, like dexamethasone, which is a steroid medication, and remdesivir, which is another medication that's shown to help in some severe cases. And there are guidelines that help doctors and nurses figure out when to use these. The National Institutes of Health, the NIH, in fact, which is one of the most important scientific bodies, like in our country, has actually put together treatment guidelines for COVID-19. So wherever you are in the United States, if you're working in a clinic or in a large hospital or something in between, you know how to treat people with COVID-19 when they come in.
Just as a follow-up to that, you hear this ivermectin thing, right? That's obviously a hotbed thing right now. I don't know anything about it, but I know that it sounds like Japan, right? Their health minister says that this is a possible or the treatment for COVID. How are we working together with other countries to discuss these types of solutions?
The COVID-19 has actually been interesting because it's been a time where the scientific community around the world has had to work together because everyone has had to pool data, look at data, and understand, hey, what is your trial telling you? What is your experience with patients telling you? And actually, the medicines I named for you, the monoclonal antibodies, as well as the steroid medications, remdesivir, these are now used in countries all around the world. And there have been discussions among researchers, across the world about these therapies. And there's generally as close a consensus as you can get that there is good evidence that these work. But with these other medications, including ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, there hasn't been strong enough evidence to show that it is actually effective. You can always find anecdotes, or you may hear about anecdotes where somebody took some medicine and they got better, but you never really know, was it the medicine that actually made them better, or did they get better on their own? Or did they get better in spite of the medication? Were there complications? With hydroxychloroquine, for example, a lot of people thought that would be useful in the general population, but when it was really studied, not only was it found not to be helpful, but there were actually complications that certain people ended up experiencing, including heart irregularities, or what are called arrhythmias, when they took that medication. So that's why the trials are really important. There's not enough data to show us that they are both safe and effective for COVID-19.
Okay, so
and Brock, does that make sense? If we can dig in more, if it's helpful, you just tell me.
No, that does, and I guess maybe a follow up to that. How have How has the data and the numbers, how have they improved once we've gotten this regimen down and
what we've seen is that when we're able to get people on the monoclonal antibody therapy early in the course of illness, they do have a significant reduction in bad outcomes, specifically in hospitalization and death. We've seen that remdesivir in people who are critically ill can actually shorten the amount of time that they're in the hospital. The steroids work well too. But here's the important piece. None of these are a magical cure, or, like sometimes, if you have an infection, you take an antibiotic and it clears the infection really effectively. We don't have that kind of silver bullet for COVID-19 yet. So while they help, it's still important that we look for other ways to prevent people from getting sick, because you can't guarantee that just because we have some medicines at work that they're actually going to save someone's life. They reduce the chances you'll get really ill, but they're not 100%.
One of the questions I would have is how, say someone did have or had COVID, right, and had natural antibodies. Mm-hmm. What is the difference, or is there any credible data as far as the difference in transmission rates between someone who has had natural antibodies as far as passing it along to someone as there is with someone that is vaccinated?
People have asked the question, do I have protection if I have had an infection in the past? And the answer is you've got some protection. Yes, your body, whenever it's challenged with a virus or bacteria, it will develop antibodies that'll help protect you against the next potential round of infection. But here, there are two interesting data points that might be of note to you. So one is that we know that when people are infected and then they get a dose of the vaccine, they boost their antibodies to incredibly high levels. So the level of protection they get is really extraordinary. The second thing we know is when we study people who have had prior infection, where one group actually has gotten vaccinated and the other group has not, but both have had prior infection, what we find is that the people who had prior infection and got vaccinated do much better. And the folks who had prior infection but weren't vaccinated are more than twice as likely to get reinfected, right? If you get reinfected, especially with Delta, our concern is that you likely can transmit to other people. Right. And so whether or not, you have a breakthrough infection, for a vaccine, or whether you have had a prior infection and you get reinfected again, we have reason to believe and to worry that you will be able to transmit to other people, which is why we're saying to folks who had prior infection that while you probably do have some degree of protection, if you get an additional dose of the vaccine, that will really boost your protection to high levels and will significantly reduce the chances that you'll be reinfected and that you will then reinfect others.
Okay.
Does that make sense, Brock?
Yes, it does. Yep. Mm-hmm. Maybe just final wrap it up for me. Why is this different than every other situation we've been in where getting vaccinated has always been a personal choice? That it's not something that has become politicized. And I guess maybe just big picture, why young, healthy America, big picture for you would be the pitch.
The only way we're going to stop this virus from transmitting, and hurting people and ultimately costing us lives is if more and more of us get vaccinated. Because each one of us, when we are vaccinated, we give the virus one less place to hide. And the more it can hide in people, that means it can continue to replicate, it can mutate, we will get new variants, and the virus will continue to spread. There are times in our country's history where we've made a decision that for the collective well-being of society, we've all got to take certain steps. This is one of those moments where we know that the more people who are immunized against COVID-19, the quicker we can shut it down, the quicker we can save lives, the quicker we can get back to our way of life, which is really what we all want. And that's why, when I talk to folks across the country, my message is really simple, which is that this vaccine is our pathway to end the pandemic. It's how we're going to get back to seeing our family and friends and not worrying about infecting them. It's how we're going to get back to going to concerts and games, about not only getting our kids back to school, but keeping them in school, and how we're going to get back to the workplaces and not worry that we're going to infect other people in the process. So it's been a tough journey, but we've got a pathway out of it. We just have to make sure more people have accurate information, because there's a lot of noise out there. And I don't blame people who are confused and who are just unsure of what to think. But we just got to make sure we're helping each other get that accurate information so we can make the best decisions for our health.
Maybe you just need to do one of these with every person in the country. I thank you for your transparency. I really appreciate it. This has been an honor. So thank you very much, Doctor.